In the autumn of 413 BCE, deep inside the limestone quarries of Syracuse, Sicily, 7,000 surviving Athenian soldiers were left to slowly die of starvation and disease. Trapped against the sheer sun-scorched walls of the pit, these prisoners represented the absolute collapse of the greatest military endeavor of their age. This wretched group was the final remnant of an invasion force that originally numbered 40,000 men and over 200 triremes. They had not been defending their homeland against an invading army. Instead, they had sailed hundreds of miles across the Mediterranean in a pure war of conquest, driven entirely by imperial hubris. Within months, that unmatched armada was burned, the veteran hoplites were broken, and the undisputed naval supremacy of Athens was erased forever. How did the wealthiest, most powerful democracy in the Greek world willingly vote to launch a fleet it did not need, into a theater it did not understand, only to systematically destroy itself? Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today, we break down the Sicilian Expedition, the massive tactical blunder, the political betrayals, and the fatal arrogance that shattered the Athenian Empire before Rome ever took the stage. To understand how 40,000 men were marched into a death trap, we must look not at the battlefield, but at the political arena that sent them there. By 415 BCE, the city-state of Athens was enjoying the fragile fruits of a hard-won ceasefire. The Peace of Nicias, signed in 421 BCE, had temporarily halted the grinding attrition of the Peloponnesian War against Sparta. This pause in hostilities left the Athenian imperial government highly secure and aggressively wealthy. The Delian League, initially forged as a mutual defense pact against the Persian Empire, had long since been reorganized into a strict tribute collection system. Allied states functioned less as partners and more as subjects, required to continually fund the Athenian naval machine. The gleaming silver of thousands of tribute coins was hauled continuously into the fortified treasuries of the Parthenon, a physical testament to an undisputed maritime supremacy that ultimately blinded the assembly to the cold reality of the map. The diplomatic trigger for disaster arrived from the distant west. Envoys from the minor Sicilian city of Segesta appeared before the assembly, offering financial compensation in exchange for military backing against their expanding neighbor Syracuse. To the aggressive imperialists voting in the assembly, this was not a localized dispute. It was a highly lucrative pretext to invade and subjugate the entirety of Sicily, an island possessing vast agricultural wealth and strategic timber reserves. However, the enthusiasm for conquest completely ignored the logistical nightmare of projecting military force across the Mediterranean. Sicily lay hundreds of miles outside the established Athenian sphere of influence. Sustaining a massive invasion force across that expanse of open water meant stretching supply lines to their absolute breaking point, relying on precarious alliances with coastal cities for food, fresh water, and safe harbor. This was not a campaign born of defensive necessity, but a colossal overreach fueled by an empire that had forgotten how to calculate operational risk. The assembly voted overwhelmingly to authorize the war, convinced that their triremes alone guaranteed victory. But to launch an armada of this unprecedented scale required a supreme commander, and Athens was torn between two generals who despised everything the other stood for. The Athenian assembly required leadership for this massive undertaking, but their democratic selection process resulted in a fractured and paralyzed command structure. The primary instigator of the war was General Alcibiades, a young, highly charismatic, and recklessly ambitious aristocrat. He viewed the conquest of Syracuse not as an end, but merely as a staging ground for a much larger campaign to dominate the entire Western Mediterranean. Opposing him was General Nicias, an older, highly cautious statesman and the very architect of the recent peace treaty with Sparta. Nicias viewed the Sicilian endeavor as a guaranteed strategic disaster. He argued vehemently that Athens could not afford to stretch its logistical network to the breaking point, while their Peloponnesian enemies were merely resting and rearming. To mediate between this toxic political rivalry, the assembly appointed a third commander, Lamachus. He was a veteran pragmatist, but his practical battlefield experience was entirely overshadowed by the immense political influence of his two peers. In a desperate bid to cancel the expedition, Nicias employed a high-risk political maneuver. He stood before the assembly and drastically exaggerated the required military commitment, claiming that subduing a fortified city like Syracuse would require an armada far larger than initially proposed. He hoped the staggering financial and human cost would shock the voting populace into abandoning the war entirely. Instead, the strategy backfired catastrophically. The Athenian public, intoxicated by imperial overconfidence and the promise of endless plunder, enthusiastically approved the inflated demands without hesitation. In a single fatal vote, they committed to stripping the city of its defensive core, authorizing a massive fleet of 134 triremes and over 5,100 heavily armored hoplites. The structural failure of this democratic decision was profound. The assembly had essentially forced Nicias, the one man who thoroughly understood the logistical impossibilities of the campaign and actively predicted its total failure, to serve as its supreme commander, yoked permanently to the very rival whose boundless ambition had manufactured the crisis. This divided triumvirate was expected to project seamless Athenian authority across hundreds of miles of open water, yet they could not even agree on the fundamental objective of the invasion before leaving port. Despite the crippling internal division, the preparations were finalized, and the shipyards of Piraeus echoed with the rhythmic hammering of timber and bronze as the Grand Armada was assembled. The greatest fleet in Greek history was finally ready to sail, but on the morning of their departure, the entire city awoke to a terrifying omen. On the eve of the fleet departure, in 415 BCE, Vandals systematically defaced the sacred stone statues marking boundaries and crossroads throughout Athens. To a deeply religious society, this was a catastrophic omen, an act of sacrilege that threatened to strip the expedition of divine favor. Political enemies of General Alcibiades immediately seized the crisis, accusing the charismatic commander of orchestrating the vandalism during a drunken revelry. Despite the paralyzing atmosphere of suspicion, the sheer momentum of the military buildup could not be halted. The Grand Armada launched from Piraeus amidst a deafening chorus of prayers and trumpets, projecting an image of unified imperial strength that entirely masked the fractured political reality. The fleet had barely established a foothold in Sicily when domestic political maneuvering delivered a fatal blow to the command structure. The Athenian state trireme arrived at the forward encampment, carrying official orders for Alcibiades to return home and stand trial for religious crimes. Knowing a politically motivated death sentence awaited him, Alcibiades made a devastating calculation. He abandoned his command, slipped away from his escorts, and defected directly to Sparta, the mortal enemy of the Athenian Empire. This treason fundamentally altered the strategic balance of the Peloponnesian War. Athens lost its most aggressive tactician, and worse, Alcibiades immediately laid out the entire Athenian operational plan to the Spartan military leadership, explaining exactly how to dismantle the siege. Back in Sicily, the command structure collapsed into exactly the configuration the assembly should have feared most. General Nicias, an aging commander who was chronically ill and fundamentally opposed to the war, was left with almost unchecked authority over the massive expedition. Rather than executing a swift, overwhelming strike against Syracuse before it could organize its defenses, Nicias reverted to his natural caution. He ordered the fleet to spend the crucial autumn months sailing cautiously around the island periphery, seeking minor alliances and gathering modest funds, wasting the psychological shock of the invasion. With Alcibiades gone, the campaign lost its aggressive momentum, granting the city of Syracuse the one resource they desperately needed. time. Despite the agonizing delays, the sheer scale of the Athenian force eventually compelled action. In the spring of 414 BCE, the expedition executed a highly successful amphibious landing and rapidly seized the plateau of Epipolae, a steep limestone ridge overlooking Syracuse. Control of this high ground was an absolute tactical necessity. It dictated the flow of supplies and provided the physical foundation for the Athenian siege strategy. The operational plan relied on constructing a massive, continuous stone wall across the plateau to completely sever Syracuse from the interior of Sicily, while the fleet blockaded the harbor. The Athenian heavy infantry temporarily transitioned into laborers, and the heights soon echoed with the grinding sound of massive limestone blocks being dragged across the rocky terrain under the brutal Mediterranean sun. The Syracusans recognized that if this primary wall reached the sea, their city would be systematically strangled. In response, they initiated a desperate defense, constructing rapid counterwalls that projected outward from their own fortifications to intersect and block the Athenian construction path. A grueling phase of engineering warfare followed, characterized by swift infantry skirmishes over half-built stone lines. During one of these chaotic localized engagements, the Athenian command structure suffered its final fatal reduction. General Lamachus, the only experienced and tactically aggressive commander remaining, was killed in action while leading a sudden counterattack. His death left the expedition entirely in the hands of Nicias, a general crippled by chronic illness, and fundamentally opposed to the campaign. He was now forced to govern alone. Even under the hesitant leadership of Nicias, the sheer industrial capacity of the Athenian war machine almost achieved its objective. The siege wall crept relentlessly toward the water, cutting off overland trade routes and driving the besieged city to the brink of starvation. The Athenian Empire stood on the very edge of its greatest military triumph, leveraging its immense logistical network to break the opposing city's will to fight. Morale within the defending government collapsed so completely that local political factions began actively drafting terms of capitulation. Syracuse was entirely blockaded by land and sea, and surrender was being negotiated until a single ship slipped through the Athenian blockade carrying one man. That single ship brought Gylippus, a highly trained Spartan commander, sent on the direct advice of the traitor Alcibiades. Upon landing, Gylippus did not bring a massive army, but rather a profound shift in tactical vision and rigid Peloponnesian discipline. He immediately reorganized the demoralized Syracusan militia, transforming them from a panicked civilian defense force into a coordinated military unit. Leadership acted as a massive force multiplier. He recognized that the Syracusan cavalry was their most vital asset and integrated it effectively to dominate the open ground. Within days of his arrival, the psychological balance of the siege was fundamentally inverted. Gylippus quickly seized the initiative by targeting the vulnerabilities in the incomplete Athenian siege lines. He ordered the construction of a rapid cross wall designed to push outward and perpendicularly intersect the Athenian primary wall on the heights of Epipolae. The Athenian heavy infantry, exhausted from months of labor, failed to halt this aggressive engineering counteroffensive. The harsh scrape of Syracusan masonry, finally interlocking across the plateau, physically severed the Athenian line, permanently preventing Syracuse from being surrounded. This single piece of infrastructure caused a devastating tactical shift. The Athenians lost the initiative entirely. Cut off from completing their blockade, they transitioned instantly from the besiegers to the besieged. Trapped outside the city walls, the Athenian logistical network began to collapse. The famed triremes, left stationary in the water for over a year without dry dock maintenance, were actively rotting. Below the waterline, the wooden hulls were becoming dangerously waterlogged, stripping the fleet of the speed and maneuverability required for traditional ramming tactics. Worse, the primary encampment had been pushed back toward the malarial swamps surrounding the great harbor. Disease swept through the ranks, and the stagnant, foul-smelling air of the marsh choked the lungs of the confined oarsmen and veteran hoplites alike. General Nicias, himself suffering from a severe chronic illness, recognized the grim reality of their position. He dispatched a brutally honest, desperate letter to the assembly in Athens, detailing the deteriorating ships and the tactical reversal. He formally requested either the immediate recall of the expedition or a massive infusion of reinforcements, fully expecting the politicians to choose withdrawal. Upon receiving the letter, the civilian government in Athens was faced with a clear strategic exit from a failing campaign. The logistical impossibilities that Nicias had originally warned them about had materialized completely. Yet, gripped by imperial arrogance and a refusal to accept a humiliating defeat, the politicians refused to recall their dying general or their rotting fleet. Instead of authorizing a retreat, the Athenian assembly made their second fatal mistake. They doubled down. In the summer of 413 BCE, the Athenian Empire delivered a staggering display of maritime logistics by projecting a second massive armada across the Mediterranean. General Demosthenes arrived in the Great Harbor with 73 fresh triremes and an additional 5,000 heavily armored hoplites. His arrival temporarily shocked the Syracusans, who could barely comprehend the sheer industrial capacity required to sustain such a prolonged overseas commitment. However, Demosthenes was a pragmatist. Surveying the disease-ridden camps, the deteriorating ships, and the unyielding Syracusan cross-wall, he immediately recognized that the strategic window for a protracted siege had completely closed. Athens could not win by starvation. They had to break the deadlock immediately or withdraw entirely. He concluded that the entire campaign hinged on a single operational objective. The Syracusan crosswall on the heights of Epipolae had to be destroyed and control of the plateau reclaimed. Knowing that a daytime frontal assault against fortified positions would result in prohibitive casualties, Demosthenes initiated a highly unconventional and high-risk tactic, a massive night offensive. Under the cover of darkness, he led his fresh hoplites and light infantry up the steep, craggy approaches of Epipolae. Initially, the element of surprise yielded success. The Athenians overran the first Syracusan outposts and began actively dismantling the cross wall. But as the offensive pushed deeper across the plateau, the fundamental dangers of night warfare in antiquity began to systematically dismantle their command and control. The complex maneuver required strict formation discipline, a factor fundamentally incompatible with the treacherous terrain and the deceptive elongated shadows cast by a pale moon. As Syracusan and allied Peloponnesian reinforcements rushed to plug the gap, the battle dissolved into fatal disorientation. The heavy Athenian infantry formations, trained to fight shoulder to shoulder in daylight, completely fragmented on the uneven ground. Without clear visibility or standardized uniforms, communication collapsed entirely. Athenian troops, hearing the Doric dialect spoken by both their own allies and the enemy, began engaging in rampant friendly fire. Panic rippled through the fractured lines, causing a complete collapse of command cohesion. As the vanguard was violently repulsed, they collided with their own advancing reinforcements, creating a deadly crush. Hundreds of retreating hoplites, blinded by the chaos and unfamiliar with the geography, fell to their deaths over the sheer limestone cliffs of the plateau. The night assault, intended to save the expedition, instead broke its last remaining offensive capability. Surveying the heavy casualties and the shattered morale of his forces the following morning, Demosthenes accepted the grim reality. The heights of Epipolae were permanently lost, and the expedition was now strategically bankrupt. He bypassed the paralyzed Nicias and ordered an immediate naval evacuation, intent on saving the remaining fleet and the lives of thousands of citizen soldiers. But just as the Armada prepared to lift anchor and escape the hostile harbor, the heavens themselves intervened to stop them. On the night of August 27th, 413 BCE, a total lunar eclipse cast a dark shadow over the Sicilian coast. To General Demosthenes, This was a minor astronomical event to be ignored during a military retreat. To the deeply superstitious General Nicias, it was a paralyzing omen of divine wrath. Refusing to move against what he believed was the will of the gods, Nicias immediately consulted his priests and issued a fatal command. The evacuation would be delayed for an entire lunar cycle of 27 days. The expeditionary force was forced to sit idle in their disease-ridden camps, their morale hemorrhaging while their supplies dwindled. This religious paralysis stood in stark contrast to the ruthless pragmatism of the Syracusans. Realizing the Athenians were actively attempting to flee, the defenders seized the operational pause to permanently trap their enemy. They rapidly moved their own vessels across the narrow entrance of the Great Harbor, chaining ships and heavy barges together to create an impenetrable barricade. When the Athenians finally launched a desperate breakout attempt, the resulting engagement was stripped of all traditional naval tactics. Nearly 200 warships were violently crammed into the enclosed, shallow waters of the Great Harbor, completely nullifying the core Athenian advantage of speed and maneuverability. An Athenian trireme relied on vast stretches of open water to execute complex flanking maneuvers and broadside ramming. Confined within the tightening ring of the Syracusan blockade, these highly engineered vessels were reduced to static, floating infantry platforms. Recognizing this spatial constraint, the Syracusan commanders had actively modified their own ships, reinforcing the prows with thick wooden beams designed specifically for brutal head-on collisions. Instead of outmaneuvering the Athenians, the heavier Syracusan vessels simply drove straight into their fragile bows, crushing the lighter timber. The engagement devolved into a chaotic, close-quarters infantry melee, with hoplites exchanging heavy missile fire across sinking decks. The systematic destruction of the Athenian armada was an industrial-scale catastrophe. As the Syracusan galleys repeatedly rammed the trapped fleet, the deafening crash of splintering timber echoed continuously across the enclosed bay, marking the physical end of a maritime empire. Thousands of seasoned oarsmen and veteran marines drowned in the congested waters or were cut down by javelins hurled from the surrounding shorelines. Decades of unrivaled naval supremacy and the immense financial investments of the Delian League dissolved into the shallow surf. The remaining Athenian vessels were either captured, sunk, or driven violently onto the muddy banks, permanently severing the expedition's supply line and its sole avenue of escape. The campaign was fundamentally broken. With their fleet burning in the harbor, 40,000 surviving Athenians had only one desperate option left: march into the hostile interior of Sicily. Leaving their dead unburied and their ruined fleet behind, the remaining 40,000 Athenian soldiers and allies began a desperate overland retreat into the hostile interior of Sicily. Stripped of their maritime supply lines, they marched entirely without rations or reliable sources of fresh water. The Syracusan defense, now firmly guided by the Spartan commander Gylippus, recognized that they did not need to engage this massive force in a pitched infantry battle. Instead, Gylippus deployed his superior cavalry and highly mobile light infantry to systematically dismantle the retreating column. Darting in to hurl javelins and immediately pulling back before the heavy Athenian hoplites could close the distance, the Syracusan riders dictated the pace and direction of the march. Driven away from every accessible well and continuously bombarded by missile fire, the immense, exhausted formation was slowly bled of its operational strength. Under the continuous pressure of harassment and severe sleep deprivation, the Athenian command structure fundamentally fractured. On the sixth day of the retreat, the rear guard under the command of General Demosthenes became separated from the main body during a chaotic night march. Isolated and pinned against a walled olive grove, Demosthenes found his forces completely surrounded by Syracusan light troops. Recognizing the tactical impossibility of breaking out without heavy cavalry support, and with his men physically incapable of sustaining a shield wall, Demosthenes formally surrendered his surviving 6,000 troops. General Nicias, marching ahead with the vanguard, received word of the capitulation, but initially refused to submit, pushing his remaining men forward in a futile attempt to reach friendly territory. The final collapse of the expeditionary force occurred on the steep rocky banks of the river Asinarus. Maddened by severe dehydration after days of forced marching under the Mediterranean sun, the Athenian vanguard completely lost all tactical discipline upon seeing the muddy water below. Formation cohesion evaporated instantly as thousands of heavily armored men broke ranks and scrambled down the riverbanks, trampling their own comrades in a desperate bid to drink. The Syracusan cavalry and infantry quickly occupied the high ground on both sides of the river and poured continuous missile fire into the disorganized mass below. The heavy casualties inflicted here were not the result of a traditional infantry clash, but a total breakdown of command authority under the unbearable physiological pressure of profound thirst. Realizing his army had disintegrated completely, Nicias finally surrendered directly to Gylippus, hoping to secure standard protections for his surviving men. However, domestic political rage in Syracuse overruled military convention. Both Nicias and Demosthenes were swiftly executed without trial. The campaign had ended in absolute defeat, but for the 7,000 common soldiers who surrendered at the river, the true punishment was just about to begin. The 7,000 Athenian and allied prisoners were marched down into the deep limestone quarries of Syracuse, a site that served as both their prison and their ultimate tomb. Stripped of their equipment, they were packed tightly into the sheer open-air pits, completely exposed to the blistering Mediterranean sun by day and the freezing temperatures by night. The Syracusan government provided them with only a half pint of water and a single pint of grain daily, a logistical calculation designed strictly to prolong starvation rather than sustain life. For 70 days, the living, the dying, and the dead were left crowded together in the confined space until the vast majority of the once proud expeditionary force perished from severe exposure and rampant disease. The tragedy within those stone walls was the physical manifestation of a profound geopolitical collapse. The Sicilian Expedition was not just a battlefield defeat. It was the self-inflicted amputation of the Athenian imperial core. In a single stroke of strategic overreach, the democratic government had voluntarily erased its grand fleet, thousands of its most experienced heavy infantry, and an entire generation of irreplaceable maritime leadership. The psychological shockwaves of this disaster permanently shattered the carefully maintained myth of Athenian invincibility across the Mediterranean. Recognizing the sudden structural vulnerability of their master, subjugated tributary states across the Delian League rapidly began to declare open rebellion. Sparta, heavily funded by Persian gold and seizing the strategic momentum, went on the offensive, establishing permanent garrisons on Athenian territory and systematically dismantling what remained of their fragile logistical network. Driven by an intoxicating mix of economic greed and unchecked political arrogance, Athens had deployed an armada it did not require into a theater it fundamentally could not supply. The campaign remains a stark historical testament to the extreme fragility of imperial power, proving definitively that even the most dominant military superpower can orchestrate its own destruction from the inside out. If you want to understand the tactical decisions that shaped the ancient world, subscribe to our channel to relive the great chapters of history together.